Hey all, very quickly before the video starts, I just want to say I'm running to be this year's Face of Horror, and I would love it if I could have your votes. I'll explain more about this at the end of the video, but just in case you have to stop before then and don't get there for some reason, please check out the link in the description and pinned comment, and be sure to vote for me daily. I think with you lot helping me, I might actually stand a chance of winning this thing. Anyway, that's all for the quick plug, now on to the main video. So, it's officially spooky season, and while I'm unable to do another wholesome Halloween this year, that doesn't mean there's any shortage of cool and interesting new horror films coming out that I can't take a quick look at. One horror film that I saw recently that's been making quite the waves is director and writer Parker Finn's debut feature, Smile, which possibly, and thanks to a genuinely really clever and unique marketing campaign, saw big numbers on its opening weekend, doing much better than the studio had supposedly anticipated. Now, making money is one thing, but is the film actually any good? Well, if you ask me, that answer is a resounding, yeah, kinda, I think so. Sort of. Smile is a film I've always had some small level of trepidation for. The first time I saw the trailer advertising this creepy tale of a psychologist seemingly haunted by some evil entity that takes on the form of sinisterly smiling friends and strangers, it all seemed initially really compelling. One thing that massively helped sell the whole film to me was the exceptionally subversive and imaginative scare that first trailer ended on. I won't spoil the almost Junji Ito-esque visual here, but if you've seen it, you absolutely know the one I'm referring to. A super fun fake out that acts as a perfect "I want more of that" punch to leave the title lingering in your mind long after you've left the screen you saw it on. On the other hand though, this was a trailer that played a lot in movie previews thanks to its aggressive marketing campaign. And while I'm aware it was never really the film's fault that this kind of softened the punch of all the big scares they were teasing, I did find myself getting less and less excited about the movie's release the more I saw of it. The whole passed on curse concept felt interesting on that initial viewing, where your brain was still distracted by the mystery of, ooh, what's this shiny new thing? And the smiling was creepy. Or was it? With each play of the trailer, I saw the argument to see the film becoming less and less compelling. I started to be reminded of other, not particularly great movies. The passed on curse is nothing new in horror films, and it can certainly be done in an exceptionally chilling way, as we've seen in genre-defining classics such as Ringu, or a really solid modern effort like It Follows. But the particular way in which the protagonist seemed to be investigating her current circumstances through other victims that came in the form of exposition-dumb characters weirdly reminded me of... You remember that really not great movie about the haunted app that told people when they would die called Countdown? Yeah, that. I hadn't thought about that film since it released in 2019, and yet, seeing the Smile trailer repeatedly, I couldn't help but now draw mental comparisons between the two. There was just something about them felt similar. And as for the whole gimmick around smiling, there was a point where I realised I'd seen that gimmick before and... Oh god no. The last film you want to conjure memories of is that god-awful Truth or Dare movie. I mean, in fairness, that film did make this whole shtick look a lot more dopey, but still, I had to wonder, was Smile doomed for the same fate? The more I thought about it, there were some segments of the trailer that came off less scary or tense and more kind of hokey. How much of the final film was going to be these weak elements, and how much of it was going to be the more interesting stuff like that final surprise scare? Well, it turns out that the film is kind of a balancing act between both these things, one that thankfully leans more towards the positive in terms of scares and direction, but loses some of its tension to the occasional section that just doesn't play out as well as the filmmakers probably hoped, and what's in my opinion, a pretty underwhelming plot. As already briefly touched on, Smile follows a practicing psychologist, Dr. Rose Cotter, who is seemingly afflicted with some sinister curse. But to go more in depth, the central conceit of the narrative is that one day, a last-minute patient begins describing a strange and sinister evil presence stalking her, one that only she can see and that she alleges takes the form of smiling human avatars. Friends, strangers, family, you never know what it's going to look like, only that it will have an insidious grin plastered on its face when it comes for you. Our protagonist Rose puts this down to psychological issues, but then the patient adopts an uncharacteristically creepy grin herself before ending her own life in an extremely violent manner. Seemingly traumatized by the incident, Rose's own mental health starts to deteriorate, or at least that's what could be going on, But as a series of horrifying incidents begin to occur around her, slowly increasing in frequency and intensity, and often carried out by an eerie smiling presence, Rose becomes convinced she has fallen victim to the same evil entity her now dead patient was trying to warn her about. And as her friends and family think she's suffering from some kind of delusional mental lapse, Rose ends up having to investigate the origins of this evil mostly on her own, all the while unsure she can even trust her own mind. It's not a bad hook at all, and it's a premise that's delivered and executed with strong directional flair. Parker Finn is really good behind the camera. While this is his feature debut, it's not actually the first film I've seen him do, as I was lucky enough to stumble onto his previous short film, Laura Hasn't Slept, and it's really clear from both these efforts that the guy knows how to direct his performers and create an atmosphere with a palpable sense of dread. I particularly love the way he uses shadows. There's some shots in this film where there's something there, just out of sight, but lit in such a way that both you as the audience and the characters within the narrative can never be precisely certain of what you're seeing. Is there a stranger smiling at me in the darkness? Or not? Either way, the effect is always quite chilling, and Finn regularly manages to turn up the tension through clever cinematography, sound design, and creative shot usage. If there's one thing I can really praise this film for, is that it can be quite scary. That might sound like I'm damning it with faint praise. I mean, how much of a compliment is it can be quite scary, really? But I'm saying this from the perspective of someone who watches and loves a lot of horror films, and as a byproduct of that has become pretty desensitized to the scare factor often inherent with the genre. The last time I remember being scared at the cinema was in, I think, 2017 when I went to see Ghost Stories, and I'd say off the top of my head, this is maybe the most a film has scared me at all since then. A couple of the jump scares genuinely got me pretty good, and I cannot stress how much of that success in getting me was through Finn's directorial eye and the exceptional performances he got out of his actors. Special mention here goes to leading lady Sosie Bacon, who I thought was absolutely phenomenal throughout. With all that said, you're probably wondering why there's any hesitation to give you my full and hearty recommendation on this thing. Cool premise, great direction, fantastic performances, what's not to like? Well, unfortunately, it's not all as clean cut as that. While all of these elements really work in the movie's favour, there's some stuff that falls a little flat. I mentioned before that Parker Finn is really great at ramping tension, so much so that he even got me good on a few jump scares. One thing I left out of that descriptor though is he may be a little over-reliant on them. Jump scares are all well and good when they're earned and are a great way to release all the tension you've just built up in an exciting and shocking way, but it's also way too easy to just blurt a loud noise and a sudden image at people and still cause a physical bodily reaction. It doesn't necessarily mean you've scared your audience, it just means they're human and can process stimuli. I mean, honestly, the biggest jump scare reaction I ever saw in the cinema was when the dog jumped out during the bike scene in Mr. Bean's Holiday. But I don't think we're ever going to consider electing that film as a classic entry into the annals of horror history. Unfortunately, Smile tries really hard to have a jump what feels like every 5 to 10 minutes, even when there's nothing in the scene that's really meant to scare us. I counted 3 instances of a telephone suddenly loudly going off, and that feels a little cheap. It also felt like every single scene transition needed a big jump moment. The worst offender was when they cut from one scene to the extremely amplified sound and image of our protagonist opening a tin of cat food. I must stress as well, not evil cat food, not demonically possessed cat food, not cat food that sharp edges were now going to be used as a makeshift tool for murder, just a can of cat food. Now naturally, unless you have an irrational fear of the Whiskas brand, I doubt you'd find anything remotely scary about this. Yet there were still people in my screen jumped simply because the cut was so sudden and the tin sound was approximately 9,000 times louder than everything else. I want to give them the benefit of the doubt and say this wasn't meant to be a jump scare and it was just a weird audio mix, but there's something like this on almost every scene transition, so there's no chance this wasn't intentional. What's frustrating with this as well is that the filmmakers are clearly so good at building tension, but every time this happens, that tension is released where I feel like Parker Finn and his team are clearly talented enough to carry that sense of dread across scenes, rather than having to build it back up every time. I mean, to their credit, they do almost always successfully bring that dread and suspense back, but this still feels like an unusual creative choice that they're more than competent enough to not have to rely on. The big factor though that brings it down for me, however, is the narrative. There's a little bit of It Follows here, there's a little bit of Final Destination, there's bits of Truth or Dare, Countdown, and Oculus. It's all effective stuff, it's just all stuff you've probably seen a million times before, whether done a lot worse in films like The Bye Bye Man, or quite a bit better like in The Ring. And that would be fine if they were doing something interesting and unique with these familiar concepts, but the plot is... well, it's okay. It's certainly engaging enough that you want to see what happens next, but I personally didn't find anything in it to shout home about. The movie also, at least for me, felt like it really didn't have anything to say. Is it scary? Yeah, sure, but it's just scary. And that's totally fine if that's your ambition and you can still make something that's a lot of fun that's just scary, but there's clear attempts throughout the runtime made to strive to be something more. They just don't come off that well. The film, I think, definitely wants to say something about trauma. The central conceit of the curse is that it's passed on through a traumatic experience. The main character is a psychologist who deals with people suffering from trauma on the regular. Our protagonist also has her own issues around trauma, and the script brings up the notion and idea of trauma often, but it still somehow feels like a bit of a background element that kind of gets forgotten about. And maybe it's just me, but I'm not sure the film even knows what it's trying to say about trauma. At its core, there's a solid argument to be made that the film is suggesting the trauma carries through to the people around you. The way the curse works, after all, is by carrying a traumatic experience through one person who then inflicts that trauma onto the next. And that is thematically compelling. Hell, the idea of smiling through trauma is something that has a basis in real-life psychology, and exploring that as an idea through horror could make for some really interesting subject matter. There's the seed of something really captivating in that, I'm sure. But for me, the film never really goes any further with the concept beyond this idea that the effects of one person's trauma can have this ripple effect onto other people. And that's good, but to me that's just the start of something. And I want to see it explored a lot more than what this film ends up doing. There is some discussion around how people deal with these issues in there, as told through the protagonist's main arc, and I don't want to spoil anything here as this is a pretty new movie, but I will say I found the development and conclusions that character comes to be pretty substantially lacking. It all just felt a bit cut and dry to me, a bit too cleanly resolved and lacking in complexity. And a lot of the sentiment that the film tries to deliver around its explorations on trauma seem to directly contradict one another, especially when it comes to what I thought was an extremely disappointing ending. Again, I don't want to spoil anything here, but there was creative decisions taken in those final minutes that actually seemed to undo what felt like the movie's main emotional character breakthrough that happened not 10 minutes earlier. It all feels like the film was made in a very premise first and theme second manner. It's as if the smile concept and the scares and set pieces that could be constructed around that abstract idea was the driving force, and it was only after they had those elements down that there was an attempt to retroactively fit a narrative and theme around them. I don't know that that's what's happened, of course, but it's what it feels like. So in spite of all the good, there's stuff that just falls short for me that prevents me from really singing this film's praises. But another way of looking at that is the inverse is also true. The ending might be a letdown, the theme might not resonate, the jump scares may be overused, but even still, on the strength of its more imaginative moments, its tense and clever direction, and excellent performances, Smile still manages to be a movie that I almost really like. I certainly don't regret watching it. I had a fun time at the cinema, and it played really well to the fairly packed late Sunday date night crowd I saw it with. And you know, anytime original horror, never mind a horror feature debut, tops the box office with a much loved crowd pleaser, even if it isn't a crowd pleaser exactly to my taste, is in my opinion something to be celebrated. So do I think you should go see it? Yeah, sure. It's good fun. Take a date, go with some friends, have a scary good evening. It's just not personally for me going to be breaking into any of my favourite lists anytime soon. But horror is cool and I like to see it succeed, so go nuts. You might even like it a lot more than I do. And to be honest, if you're even remotely a fan of horror, or just enjoy a good day out at the movies, and who doesn't, then at the very least, you'll have a good time with it, I'm sure. Speaking of celebrating horror though, now the main video is over, I'd like to remind everyone that as a small-time horror filmmaker and YouTuber, I'm campaigning to win the new Face of Horror competition, and I'm shockingly so far doing actually pretty good and may have a shot of winning. Hard to say, but I'd love it if you guys could all support me with your votes. At the time of this writing, I've made the cult of the top 10, soon to be top 5 of my group, and I'm currently jumping almost daily between first and second place. In the next round though, possibly the current round depending on when this vid releases, they're culling it to the final one, at which point whoever is top of my group will go into a new round to face all the other group winners, so I really need your help. If you've enjoyed this video or anything I've ever done on this channel, please vote for me daily and I will love you forever. You can vote for me once or twice for free every day, or if you're so inclined, buy more votes with a charity donation to the B Plus Foundation, who are the largest providers of financial assistance to families dealing with paediatric cancer. To vote for me, just click the link in the description and follow the instructions. It'll only take you a minute, and if I was able to win this thing, it could be really huge for me, and I cannot stress how much I'd appreciate it. Every bit of help is welcome. The competition still has some rounds to go and runs all the way through to November 10th, so please vote daily if you can for as long as I'm in this thing. And especially right now, because depending on when you're watching this, I may be up for elimination. Thank you all so much, enjoy the rest of your day, and I will see you all next video.